The December wind cut through Tom McKenzie's wool coat like a cavalry saber, carrying with it the metallic scent of death that he'd learned to recognize during his years as a Union soldier. His breath formed crystalline clouds as he urged his bay gelding, Chester, down the rocky slope toward Buffalo Creek. What he'd seen from the ridge above made his stomach clench with a familiar dread. The buffalo lay scattered across the frozen meadow like dark boulders against the pristine snow, their massive bodies creating grotesque shadows in the pale afternoon light. Steam still rose from some of the carcasses, meaning the slaughter was recent, maybe hours, not days. Tom counted at least 30 animals, their thick winter coats matted with blood that had already begun to freeze into crimson ice. "Easy, boy," Tom murmured to Chester, feeling the horse's reluctance to approach the carnage. The gelding's ears flicked nervously, nostrils flaring at the overwhelming smell of blood and gunpowder that lingered in the air despite the bitter wind. Tom had seen buffalo kills before, but this was different. The animals hadn't been hunted for meat or hides. They'd been systematically slaughtered and left to rot. Bullet holes peppered their flanks in neat patterns that spoke of military precision. The U.S. cavalry's latest tactic in their campaign against the Apache: destroy their food source, force them onto reservations. As he guided Chester between the corpses, Tom's weathered hands tightened on the reins. At 43, he'd seen enough senseless killing to last several lifetimes. The war between the states, Indian raids on his ranch that had taken his wife Sarah and infant son, and now this, the systematic destruction of an entire way of life. A movement near the largest bull caught his eye. At first he thought it was just the wind stirring the animal's shaggy coat, but then he saw it again, deliberate, purposeful. Someone was alive down there. Tom's hand instinctively moved to the colt, 45 on his hip as he dismounted, his boots crunching through the snow-crusted ground. He'd learned the hard way never to approach anything in Apache territory without being ready for trouble, but as he drew closer, circling around the massive bull's head, what he saw made him freeze in his tracks. A young Apache girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, crouched behind the buffalo's enormous shoulder. Her dark hair hung in tangled braids around a face streaked with blood and tears. She wore traditional buckskin clothing, now torn and stained, and clutched a small beaded pouch against her chest with hands that shook from cold and terror. The girl's dark eyes met his, and Tom saw something that hit him like a physical blow, the same expression his own son had worn in those final moments before the raiders struck. Not just fear, but the devastating realization that everything safe and familiar in her world had been destroyed. "Jesus," Tom whispered, holstering his weapon. The girl couldn't weigh more than 70 pounds, and from the blue tinge to her lips and the way she trembled, she was close to freezing to death. He took a careful step forward, speaking in the gentle tone he'd once used with spooked cattle. "Easy there, little one, I'm not going to hurt you." The girl pressed herself tighter against the buffalo's still warm flank, her eyes darting between Tom and the surrounding carnage. She spoke in rapid Apache, her voice barely above a whisper, but Tom caught the universal tone of desperation and grief. "I don't understand the words," Tom said, slowly removing his heavy coat despite the biting cold, "but I know that sound. You've lost everything, haven't you?" As he knelt in the snow, making himself less threatening, Tom's mind raced through his limited Apache vocabulary, words he'd learned from trading with peaceful bands before the current troubles escalated. "Ayana," he asked, pointing to her and using the word for little flower or child. The girl's eyes widened slightly at hearing her language, and she nodded once, quickly. She pointed to herself and said something that sounded like Ayana, confirming his guess, then gestured at the dead buffalo around them while tears streamed down her cheeks. Tom felt his throat tighten. This child had witnessed the slaughter of her people's sacred animals, possibly her own family members. In her eyes he saw the same devastation he'd carried since losing Sarah and little James, the hollow ache of being suddenly, completely alone in a hostile world. "Ayana," he repeated softly, then placed his hand over his heart and said, Tom McKenzie." The girl studied his face with an intensity that seemed far too old for her years. Behind her intelligent gaze, Tom could see her making calculations, weighing her options, measuring his threat level, deciding whether this white man represented salvation or just another danger in a world that had already taken everything from her. The decision was made for both of them when Ayana suddenly swayed, her small body finally succumbing to exhaustion and cold. Tom lunged forward, catching her just before she collapsed into the bloody snow. She was lighter than he'd expected, her body trembling uncontrollably as hypothermia began to claim her. "I've got you," Tom murmured, wrapping his coat around her small frame. "You're safe now. I promise. You'll never be alone again." As he lifted Ayanna into his arms and carried her toward Chester, Tom made a vow that would change both their lives forever. Whatever had brought this child to Buffalo Creek, whatever forces had torn her world apart, he would stand between her and any further harm. The wind picked up, scattering snow across the massacre site, and Tom quickened his pace toward home, toward a future neither of them could yet imagine, but one that would require more courage than either had ever needed before. The McKenzie ranch house sat like a weathered sentinel against the Arizona landscape, its adobe walls and timber frame designed to withstand both the scorching summers and bitter winters that defined this unforgiving territory. As Tom guided Chester up the familiar path, Ayanna's unconscious form cradled in his arms, he felt the weight of what he was about to do settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. The girl hadn't stirred during the hour-long ride home, her breathing shallow but steady against his chest. Tom had stopped twice to check her pulse and adjust his coat around her, each time fighting the memory of another child he'd failed to save. But James had been his own flesh and blood. This girl was Apache, one of the people who had destroyed his family. The irony wasn't lost on him. "What the hell am I doing, Chester?" he muttered as he dismounted, careful not to jostle Ayanna. The horse snorted and shook his head, as if sharing his master's uncertainty. The ranch house felt impossibly quiet as Tom pushed through the front door, his boots echoing on the pine floorboards Sarah had insisted on when they'd built the place 12 years ago. Everything remained exactly as she'd left it. The lace curtains, the china cabinet filled with her mother's dishes, the rocking chair where she'd nursed James. Tom had found comfort in the familiar arrangement during his 3 years of solitude, but now it felt like a shrine to the dead. He carried Ayanna to the small bedroom that had been James's nursery, then his boys' room until that terrible day. Tom hadn't entered it since the funeral, but now he pushed open the door and was struck by the stale air and dust motes dancing in the afternoon light, filtering through unwashed windows. The child's bed was still made with Sarah's quilted coverlet, the wooden toy soldiers Tom had carved still arranged on the small table by the window. He laid Ayanna down gently, her dark skin a stark contrast against the pale blue fabric. She looked even smaller in the bed that had been meant for his son. "First things first," Tom said aloud, needing to hear his own voice in the oppressive silence. "Get you warm and dry." He built up the fire in the main room's stone hearth until it roared with heat, then hauled bucket after bucket of water from the well to fill the large copper tub Sarah had ordered from back east. The physical labor helped quiet his churning thoughts, at least temporarily. When he returned to check on Ayanna, she was awake, sitting up against the headboard, with her dark eyes tracking his every movement. The beaded pouch remained clutched in her hands, and Tom noticed for the first time that it was decorated with intricate buffalo designs, probably a sacred item, something that connected her to the slaughtered herd. "You're safe," Tom said softly, remembering to keep his movements slow and non-threatening. "This is my home. You're welcome here." Ayanna spoke in Apache, her voice stronger now, but filled with questions Tom couldn't understand. She gestured toward the window, then toward herself, her meaning clear enough. She wanted to know what would happen to her. Tom sat in the small chair beside the bed, the same one where he'd kept vigil during James's brief illness. "I don't know what you're asking exactly, but I'll try to explain." He pointed to himself. "Tom lives here alone. Wife and son." He struggled to find a way to communicate death without frightening her further, finally drawing his finger across his throat. "Gone. Apache raiders 3 summers ago." Ayanna's eyes widened, and she pressed herself back against the headboard. For a moment, Tom thought she might try to run, but then her expression shifted to something he recognized, the look of someone calculating odds, weighing survival against principle. "I should hate you," Tom continued, surprising himself with his honesty. "Your people killed my family, but you're just a child, and you were dying in that snow." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I made you a promise back there, and Tom McKenzie keeps his word. You'll be safe here, but we need to get you warm and fed first." As if summoned by his words, Ayanna's stomach rumbled audibly. Despite everything, Tom found himself almost smiling. "Hungry, are you? When's the last time you ate?" The girl looked confused at his question, so Tom mimed eating. Her face crumpled slightly, and she held up what looked like 3 fingers, then pointed toward the window where the afternoon light was already beginning to fade. 3 days? Tom felt his chest tighten. "Jesus, child. No wonder you nearly froze to death." He stood and moved toward the door, but Ayanna's sharp intake of breath made him turn back. She was watching him with barely concealed panic, clearly expecting him to leave and not return, or worse, to bring back soldiers or other threats. "I'm just going to the kitchen," Tom said gently. "To get food, you understand? Food." He mimed eating again, then pointed toward the main room. "I'll be right back, I promise." The word promise seemed to resonate with her. She nodded slowly, though her grip on the beaded pouch tightened. In the kitchen, Tom found himself moving with more purpose than he'd felt in months. He'd been living on coffee, hardtack, and whatever game he could shoot, but now he rummaged through his supplies, looking for something suitable for a child who'd been starving. He settled on making a simple broth with dried beef and vegetables, something that would be easy on her stomach. While the soup simmered, Tom found himself thinking about the practicalities of his situation. Harboring an Apache child, even a harmless one, was dangerous business in current circumstances. The territorial government had posted bounties for Apache captives, and most white settlers would shoot first and ask questions later if they found one on their property. But when he returned to the bedroom with a bowl of warm broth, seeing Ayana's face light up at the sight of food, Tom knew he'd already made his choice back at Buffalo Creek. Whatever consequences followed, he would deal with them as they came. "Easy now," he cautioned as she reached eagerly for the bowl. "Small sips. Don't want you getting sick." As Ayana carefully drank the broth, her eyes never leaving his face, Tom realized that for the first time in 3 years, the ranch house didn't feel quite so empty. The silence was different now. Not the oppressive quiet of grief, but the watchful stillness of two people learning to trust each other. Outside, the wind howled around the adobe walls, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. But inside, by the warmth of the fire, Tom McKenzie and the Apache girl named Ayana began the delicate process of building something neither had expected to find again: hope. 3 days passed like a careful dance between two strangers, learning each other's rhythms. Tom maintained his morning routine, checking the cattle, mending fence, chopping wood, but now each task was punctuated by trips back to the house to check on Ayana. She'd grown stronger with regular meals and warmth, but remained watchful, her dark eyes following his every movement like a wild animal, gauging the temperament of its captor. On the 4th morning, Tom woke to find her standing at the kitchen window, still wrapped in one of Sarah's quilts, staring out at the snow-covered pasture where his small herd of cattle grazed. The sight of her there, silhouetted against the pale winter light, created an odd sense of déjà vu, as if Sarah or James might appear at any moment to complete the domestic scene. "Morning," Tom said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, nodding solemnly, and he noticed she'd braided her hair in an intricate pattern he hadn't seen before. The beaded pouch still hung around her neck, never leaving her side. "Coffee?" he asked, holding up the pot. She tilted her head questioningly, so he poured himself a cup and mimed drinking. "Bitter," he warned, making a face that finally drew what might have been the ghost of a smile from her lips. As they shared a breakfast of eggs and biscuits, Ayana eating with delicate precision, as if each bite might be her last, Tom wrestled with a decision he'd been putting off. He needed supplies from Tucson, but leaving her alone felt dangerous, and taking her would be worse. The territorial militia had been making regular sweeps through the area, hunting for Apache refugees from the recent campaigns. "Ayana," he said finally, pointing to himself, then to the horizon. "Tom, go town. You stay here safe." Her eyes widened with alarm, and she shook her head vigorously, speaking rapidly in Apache. The panic in her voice was unmistakable. She thought he was abandoning her. "No, no," Tom said quickly, holding up his hands. "Come back. Tom, come back." He pointed to the sun's position in the sky, then moved his finger to indicate where it would be in the afternoon. "Today, before dark." But Ayana continued shaking her head, her grip tightening on the quilt. Finally, she stood and walked to the gun rack beside the door, pointing at his rifle, then at herself, her meaning clear. She expected him to kill her rather than leave her behind. The gesture hit Tom like a physical blow. This child had watched her world end at Buffalo Creek. In her experience, white men brought only death and destruction. The fact that she was still alive in his house probably seemed like a cruel delay of the inevitable. "Jesus, child," Tom whispered, moving slowly toward her. "Is that what you think, that I saved you just to—" He couldn't finish the thought. Instead, he carefully took her small hands in his weathered ones, surprised by how cold they were despite the warm house. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "Tom McKenzie keeps his promises. I told you at Buffalo Creek you'd never be alone again, and I meant it." He searched his limited Apache vocabulary, finally settling on a word he thought meant family, Indar. Ayana's eyes filled with tears, and she spoke quietly in her own language, words that sounded like an explanation or maybe a confession. Tom caught fragments, something about buffalo, about people being gone, about the soldiers. Her voice broke on the last word, and suddenly she was sobbing against his chest, her small body shaking with grief she'd been holding inside for days. Tom found himself stroking her hair the way he'd comforted James during thunderstorms, whispering meaningless reassurances while she cried for her lost family, her destroyed world, her uncertain future. When the storm finally passed, she pulled back and looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes that seemed older than her years. "We'll figure this out together," Tom promised, though he had no idea how. "But first, I need you to understand something." He walked to Sarah's writing desk and pulled out a piece of paper and pencil, then drew simple stick figures, a man, woman, and small child beside a house. He pointed to himself, then crossed out the woman and child. Tom's family, gone. He drew another group, several figures in traditional Apache dress near some buffalo. He pointed to her, then crossed out all the figures except one small girl. Ayana's family, gone too. Finally, he drew a new picture, the man and the girl standing together beside the house. Now Tom and Ayana, family. Ayana stared at the drawing for a long moment, then looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. She took the pencil and carefully drew something beside the house, a small garden plot, the kind Apache women tended. Then she pointed to herself and nodded. "You want to help with the ranch work?" Tom asked, understanding. She was offering to earn her place, to contribute rather than simply survive on his charity. It was a matter of pride, something he could respect. "All right then," he decided, putting aside his plans for town. First lesson, taking care of cattle in winter. He bundled her in one of his old coats, far too large but warm, and led her outside. The cattle had gathered near the barn, their breath creating small clouds in the crisp air. Ayana watched with interest as Tom broke ice on the water trough and spread hay in the feeding area. "Buffalo and cattle not so different," he explained, miming the comparison. "Both need water, food, protection from cold." When one of the younger steers approached curiously, Ayana froze, but Tom guided her hand to touch the animal's muzzle. "Gentle," he said, "like you." For the first time since he'd found her, Ayana smiled, a real smile that transformed her entire face. The steer huffed warm breath on her palm, and she laughed, a sound like silver bells in the winter air. As they worked together through the morning, Tom began teaching her simple English words while she shared Apache names for the animals and tools. They created their own pidgin language of gestures, drawings, and mixed vocabulary that somehow bridged the gap between their worlds. But as the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, Tom's contentment was shattered by the sound every rancher in Apache territory had learned to fear, the thunder of approaching horses, too many, and moving too fast to be friendly visitors. Through the window, he could see dust rising from the main trail and the glint of metal that meant weapons, a cavalry patrol or worse, bounty hunters looking for Apache refugees. "Ayana," Tom said urgently, grabbing her shoulders. "Hide! Now! Under the bed in James's room. Don't come out until I call for you." She looked toward the approaching riders, then back at him, understanding the danger immediately. But instead of running, she stood straighter, her chin raised in defiance. "Together," she said in careful English, one of the words he'd taught her that morning. "Family." Tom felt his heart clench at her courage, even as his mind raced through their limited options. Whatever was coming down that trail, they would face it together. But he prayed it wouldn't cost them both everything they'd just begun to build. The riders that emerged from the dust cloud weren't cavalry, they were something worse. 3 hard-faced men in mismatched clothing, their horses lathered with sweat and their weapons worn smooth from constant use. Bounty hunters, the kind who made their living collecting government rewards for Apache scalps and capturing survivors to sell to the territorial authorities. Tom recognized the leader immediately, Jake Brennan, a former Confederate soldier who'd turned to hunting Apache after the war ended. Brennan's scarred face and cold gray eyes had become infamous throughout the territory, along with his reputation for bringing in his bounties more dead than alive. "Stay behind me," Tom murmured to Ayana, positioning himself between her and the approaching riders. "Whatever happens, don't let them see you understand English." Brennan dismounted with the casual confidence of a man who'd never met resistance he couldn't overcome. His companions, a Mexican gunfighter named Vargas, and a nervous-looking young man Tom didn't recognize flanked him as they approached the porch. "McKenzie," Brennan called out, his voice carrying the lazy drawl that barely concealed his predatory nature. "Heard you might have something that belongs to the government." "Don't know what you mean," Tom replied evenly, his hand resting casually near his Colt. "Just me and my cattle out here." Brennan's eyes found Ayanna, and his smile turned wolfish. "That's so, because word is, there was an Apache survivor from the Buffalo Creek operation. Little girl, about 10 years old. Army's offering $500 for her capture. Seems she might know something about gold hidden in the Dragoon Mountains." Tom's blood chilled. $500 was more money than most men saw in 2 years, enough to motivate every bounty hunter and desperado within 100 miles. But it was Brennan's mention of gold that truly worried him. If the Army believed Ayanna had valuable information, they'd never stop hunting her. "Haven't seen any Apache around here," Tom said. "Plenty of buzzards cleaning up that buffalo mess, though. Shame to waste all that meat." Vargas spat in the dust, his hand hovering near his pistol. "Don't play games with us, viejo. We tracked horse prints from Buffalo Creek straight to your ranch. Fresh prints made 3 days ago." "I ride out that way regular," Tom replied, checking on my strays. "Saw the buffalo kill. Hell of a thing. But no Apache." Brennan stepped closer, his spurs ringing against the wooden porch steps. "Mind if we look around? Just to be sure?" It wasn't really a question. Tom's mind raced through his options, none of them good. These men would search every inch of his property, and Ayanna would be impossible to hide. His only advantage was that they expected him to resist. A cooperative response might throw them off balance. "Help yourself," Tom said, stepping aside. "But I'd appreciate you not spooking my cattle. Lost enough livestock to wolves this winter." Brennan's eyes narrowed slightly, clearly suspecting a trap. Behind Tom, Ayanna remained perfectly still, her small hand clutching the beaded pouch at her throat. Tom prayed she understood the game they were about to play. The 3 men moved through the house like professionals, checking every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. When they reached James's bedroom, Tom's heart hammered against his ribs, but the room appeared empty and undisturbed. He'd made the bed that morning and removed any trace of Ayanna's presence. "Nothing here," the young bounty hunter reported, clearly disappointed. But Brennan wasn't satisfied. He stood in the center of the main room, studying the layout with predatory calculation. "Funny thing about Apache kids," he said conversationally. "They're taught from birth to hide in plain sight. Could be anywhere, really." Tom felt sweat beading on his forehead, despite the winter cold. "Like I said, haven't seen any." "What about her?" Brennan interrupted, pointing directly at Ayanna. Tom's world stopped. Ayanna stood beside the kitchen table exactly where he'd left her, but now Brennan was looking right at her with those calculating grey eyes. How had he missed her before? "Oh, that's just my ward," Tom said, his voice sounding strained even to his own ears. "Mexican girl from down south. Parents died of fever. Left her with me." Brennan moved closer to Ayanna, who stared back at him with remarkable composure for a child whose life hung in the balance. "Mexican, you say? She looks mighty dark for a Mexican. And those cheekbones." He reached out as if to touch her face. Ayanna spoke suddenly in rapid Spanish, her voice higher and more childlike than her usual tone. Tom caught fragments. Something about her mama and papa being muertos, asking if the bad men were going to hurt her. Her accent was perfect, her fear convincing, her transformation complete. Vargas laughed harshly. "Es solo una niña mexicana," he confirmed. "Just a Mexican kid. My grandmother looked just like her." But Brennan wasn't convinced. He knelt down to Ayanna's eye level, studying her face intently. "What's in the bag around your neck, little girl?" Ayanna looked to Tom with perfectly feigned confusion, speaking more Spanish. Tom translated, his mouth dry as dust. "She says it belonged to her mother. Just some beads and a saint's medal." "Let me see it," Brennan demanded. This was the moment Tom had dreaded. The beaded pouch was clearly Apache work, decorated with buffalo symbols that no Mexican child would possess. If Brennan examined it closely, their deception would crumble. But Ayanna surprised them all. With tears gathering in her eyes, she clutched the pouch to her chest and shook her head violently, speaking in Spanish about how the bad men wanted to steal her mama's memory. Her performance was so convincing that even Tom almost believed her grief was for a Mexican mother rather than her Apache family. The young bounty hunter shifted uncomfortably. "Come on, Brennan. She's just a scared kid. Let's check the outbuildings and get out of here." For a long moment, Brennan continued studying Ayanna's face, his predator's instincts warring with the evidence before him. Finally, he stood and stepped back, but his expression remained suspicious. $500 is a lot of money, McKenzie, he said softly. Makes a man very motivated to look carefully at every possibility. If I find out you're hiding that Apache girl, I'll be back. And next time, I won't be so polite. Understood, Tom replied. But you're wasting your time here. After searching the barn, the well house, and even the root cellar, the three men finally mounted their horses. As they prepared to leave, Brennan turned back one final time. That Mexican girl, he called out. What did you say her name was? Tom's mind went blank. In all their preparation, they'd never discussed what to call her if questioned. Maria, he said finally, choosing the most common Mexican name he could think of. Hayana looked up at him with those intelligent dark eyes and smiled. Si, Papa Tom, she said sweetly. Me llamo Maria. As the bounty hunters disappeared into the distance, Tom felt his knees nearly buckle with relief. But their problems were far from over. Word would spread that he was harboring a Mexican orphan, which might deflect some suspicion but would also bring unwanted attention from other quarters. More importantly, Brennan's mention of gold changed everything. If the army believed Ayana knew the location of Apache treasure, they would never stop hunting her. The sanctuary Tom had tried to provide was more fragile than he'd realized, and the promise he'd made at Buffalo Creek would require sacrifices he was only beginning to understand. How did you learn Spanish? He asked Ayana after the dust settled. She smiled sadly and switched back to her careful English. Apache learn many languages. Spanish, English, Navajo. Must understand enemies to survive. Tom nodded slowly, realizing that this child possessed intelligence and skills far beyond her years, exactly the kind of knowledge that might indeed make her valuable to both the army and their enemies. The question was whether his promise to protect her would be enough when the real test came. 2 weeks after Brennan's visit, Tom knew their borrowed time was running out. Reports trickled in from Tucson about increased bounty hunter activity and a new army unit specifically tasked with finding the Buffalo Creek survivor. The territorial governor had doubled the reward to $1,000, enough money to buy a small ranch or fund a man's retirement. The breaking point came on a crystalline February morning when Ayana approached him with the beaded pouch in her outstretched hands, her face solemn with purpose. Tom, she said in her carefully practiced English, time to tell truth. They sat by the fire while she opened the sacred pouch for the first time since he'd found her. Inside, wrapped in soft deerskin, was a small piece of quartz crystal and what looked like a crude map drawn on buffalo hide. The markings were in Apache symbols, but Tom could make out geographical features, a distinctive rock formation he recognized from the Dragoon Mountains. My grandfather, Ayana began, her voice steady despite the pain of memory. He was, how you say, keeper of sacred places. When soldiers came to Buffalo Creek, he gave me this. She touched the crystal reverently. Not gold, like white men think. Something more important. Tom studied the map, understanding dawning with cold clarity. It's a water source, isn't it? Hidden springs in the Dragoons. Ayana nodded. Sacred water. My people need for ceremony, for healing. Grandfather said someday when killing stops, Apache children must know where to find the old ways. The magnitude of what she carried hit Tom like a physical blow. This wasn't treasure in the way white men understood it. It was cultural survival, the knowledge needed to preserve Apache traditions in a world determined to erase them. But to the army and the bounty hunters, it represented something far more valuable, the location of Apache refugees that had never been mapped or conquered. They'll never stop hunting you, Tom said quietly, as long as you have this knowledge. I know. Ayana's voice was small but resolute. Is why I must go. Go? Tom felt his heart clench. Go where? Mexico. Find my mother's cousin in Sierra Madre. Give him the map, the crystal. Then soldiers have no reason to hunt little Apache girl who knows nothing. Tom stared at her, this remarkable child who had already survived more than most adults ever would. The practical part of his mind recognized the logic of her plan. Without the map, she would become just another displaced Apache orphan, hardly worth the effort of capture. But the thought of losing her, of watching her disappear into the wilderness alone, was unbearable. That's 1,000 miles through hostile territory, he said. You'd never make it alone. Apache children learn to survive, not Apache children who've been living soft for a month, eating regular meals and sleeping in warm beds, Tom interrupted, his voice harsher than he intended. "You're not the same girl I found at Buffalo Creek, Ayana. You've changed, we both have." Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses shattered the morning quiet. But this time it wasn't 3 bounty hunters. It was an entire cavalry patrol, at least 20 soldiers riding in formation with the dust cloud of a supply wagon trailing behind them. "Hide the map," Tom ordered, but Ayana was already rewrapping it in the deerskin and tucking it back into her pouch. "Remember, you're Maria, the Mexican orphan." But as the patrol rode into the yard, Tom recognized the officer in the lead, Captain William Harrison, a career soldier with a reputation for thoroughness and a particular hatred of Apache resistance. Unlike Brennan, Harrison wouldn't be fooled by a child's performance or deterred by moral qualms. "Thomas McKenzie," Harrison called out, dismounting with military precision. "By order of the territorial governor, I'm here to conduct a thorough search of these premises for Apache fugitives and contraband." "Already been searched," Tom replied, stepping onto his porch. "Brennan and his boys went through everything 2 weeks ago." Harrison's smile was cold and professional. "Mr. Brennan, while effective, lacks the Army's resources. Sergeant Martinez," a Hispanic soldier, stepped forward, carrying what looked like official papers. "We have testimonies from 3 separate sources, placing an Apache child at this location. Furthermore, our Apache scouts have confirmed tracks leading directly from Buffalo Creek to your ranch." Tom felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Apache scouts working for the Army. The ultimate betrayal, though he understood the desperate circumstances that would drive tribal members to such cooperation. "That so-called Mexican girl," Harrison continued, pointing at Ayana, "will be subjected to a proper examination by someone who can distinguish Apache from Mexican features. If she proves to be the Buffalo Creek survivor, you'll be charged with harboring a fugitive and interfering with military operations." As Harrison's men began their systematic search, Tom caught Ayana's eye. She gave him the slightest nod and he understood. She was ready to run, to implement whatever escape plan her Apache training had prepared her for. But running now would only confirm their suspicions and ensure a pursuit that would never end. "Captain," Tom said, making the hardest decision of his life, "before you waste your time on that examination, there's something you should know." Harrison paused, studying Tom's face with the keen perception of a man accustomed to reading enemy intentions. "Yes?" Tom's voice was steady, though his heart was breaking. "The girl isn't Mexican. She's Apache, and she's been here since I found her at Buffalo Creek." The admission sent a ripple of excitement through the soldiers, but Harrison remained focused on Tom. "Continue." "But she doesn't know anything about gold or hidden treasure," Tom lied smoothly. "She's just a traumatized child who watched her family die. The only reason I took her in was—" He paused, letting genuine emotion color his voice. "I lost my own son to Apache raiders 3 years ago. Seemed like maybe God was giving me a chance to balance the scales." Harrison studied him for a long moment. "A touching story, Mackenzie, but I'll need to question the girl myself to determine what she might know." "Of course," Tom agreed. "But Captain, I have a proposition that might serve both our interests." "I'm listening." Tom took a deep breath, praying that Ayana would understand and forgive what he was about to do. "The territorial governor's offering $1,000 for her capture. I'll take half that amount and sign over my legal claim to her on one condition. She goes to the Santa Fe Indian School instead of a military prison. She gets a chance at a real life instead of rotting in some cavalry stockade." The proposal clearly intrigued Harrison. The Indian schools were part of the government's policy of forced assimilation, kill the Indian, save the man. But they were vastly preferable to military detention. More importantly, Tom's offer gave the captain a way to claim success while pocketing a substantial reward. "And what guarantee do I have that you haven't already extracted whatever information she might possess?" Harrison asked. "None," Tom admitted. "But I'm a cattle rancher, not a treasure hunter. If she knew where Apache gold was hidden, don't you think I'd have gone after it myself instead of scraping by on beef sales?" Harrison considered this, his calculating gaze moving between Tom and Ayana, who had remained perfectly still throughout the negotiation, her face a mask of Apache stoicism that revealed nothing of her thoughts or feelings. $500, the captain said finally. "And I'll arrange for her transport to Santa Fe. But if we discover you've withheld any information about Apache activities or treasure locations, the deal is void and you'll be arrested as an accomplice." Tom nodded, though the words felt like swallowing broken glass. "Understood." As the paperwork was drawn up and the money counted out, Tom caught Ayana's eye one final time. What he saw there wasn't anger or betrayal, but something far more devastating: understanding. She knew he was trying to save her life the only way he could, even if it meant breaking the promise he'd made at Buffalo Creek. When the soldiers finally rode away with Ayanna sitting straight-backed on a cavalry horse, Tom remained on his porch until the dust cloud disappeared completely. Only then did he allow himself to collapse into Sarah's old rocking chair, the $500 scattered and forgotten at his feet. 3 days later, he received a telegram from Santa Fe. Apache girl escaped during transport stop. Whereabouts unknown. Captain W. Harrison. Tom smiled for the first time since the soldiers had taken her away. Somewhere out there, probably already across the Mexican border, Ayanna was carrying her grandfather's sacred knowledge to safety. The promise he'd made at Buffalo Creek, that she would never be alone again, had taken a form he'd never expected. Instead of keeping her with him, he'd given her the tools she needed to find her own people, her own future. The McKenzie ranch felt empty again, but it was a different kind of emptiness than before. This wasn't the hollow ache of loss. It was the quiet satisfaction of a promise kept, even at the cost of his own happiness. And sometimes late at night, when the wind howled around the adobe walls, Tom could swear he heard the distant sound of silver bells laughing in the darkness, reminding him that some bonds transcend distance, culture, and time.